our attention span on what's happening in multiple spaces and geographical locations going on. And in the dire and total numbers, the situation is very acute. We know that in 2022, we have more than 82 million refugees, asylum seekers, returnees, stateless, and internally displaced people. And we are expecting that in just less than 30 years, by 2050, that this number will increase to 216 million, which is a tremendous amount of people and a stark increase from 82 to 216. And we also know, as part of the backdrop, that we have witnessed, so to say, a global failure in protecting and in guaranteeing the right to education in conflict and in crises, and which we see happening as part of this displacement crisis, where many are not accessing their right to quality education and are not included, both related to the opening up after the COVID-19 pandemic in building back better to ensure that more are included, but also related to ensuring that quality education can still be provided amidst a crisis situation. So there is an urgent need for states and national governments to step up their efforts and to address this global displacement crisis taking place, and also to ensure that clear actions and measures are taken to hinder discrimination and any further marginalization of groups in the education systems globally. So I'm really glad that we here today are going to address which gaps exist in education policies, and also what plans and measures are needed based on the experiences and the practical cases from the ground, and how they can inform and assist our work at all levels. So through this event, we're aiming to raise awareness, both amongst ourselves in our education community network with a range of different national education coalitions, local, national, and global civil society organizations and multilateral organizations, but also together with governments and others who are keen to advance on this important agenda together with us. So I'm really glad that we have, as part of this event, been able to gather a range of excellent and distinguished speakers who are joining me here today at this event. We will have two excellent keynote speakers who will really hit up this event and just kickstart it with sharing some experiences from their lives and how the situation is on the ground. We will have one keynote speech from Akoy Mayan, who will share his experiences from a refugee camp, and then we'll also have one keynote speak from Stella Oriang, who is a displaced teacher working to enhance quality and inclusive education. And then we'll have, after their keynote speeches, we'll have a panel discussion that will touch upon questions that will be raised by these keynote speakers. And we will also open up for a questions and answers session in the end. So I really strongly encourage all of you who are participating at this event to think about questions or comments and reflections that you would like to raise as the event unfolds. And please do address these questions in the Q&A box that's below in your tab, in the bottom tab in your Zoom screen, and not in the chat box. But I think before we start with the keynote speeches and the panel, I would like to just shortly provide some housekeeping rules for this event. So as you might have been informed about already, we will record this event, and we're also live streaming this event. And we will also make sure that the event and the recording of the event will be available afterwards, so you can share with your friends and colleagues and others who might not be able to watch it as it's going live now. So just for your information. And then we have live interpretation happening simultaneously in 5 languages, and those are English, French, Spanish, Portuguese, and Arabic. And in order to access the preferred language of your choice, you need to go down to the small globe named interpretation in the bottom of your screen, and then access your language of choice. And please do reach out in the chat if you have any practical challenges or technical difficulties, and we'll try to sort that as we go along. And we would also really like you to introduce yourselves in the chat by writing your name and title, as it's really useful to know who we have gathered here today for this event. And please, as previously mentioned, do think about questions that can be posed to the panelists. And we strongly encourage you to type in those questions in the Q&A box and not in the chat box. And we will make sure that these questions are being assessed in the Q&A session in the end. So without much more further ado, I'm really happy to introduce our first keynote speaker for this event, Ms. Stella Oriang, who is the refugee teacher in Ogili Hills and in a primary school from Uganda. So please go ahead, and the floor is yours, and I hope we can all hear and see you clearly. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm Stella Aloy Oriang, a refugee teacher at Spalabek Refugee Settlement, one of the settlements within Uganda. It's a pleasure being with you to share a few things on equitable access to learning in displacement, taking actions against discrimination and marginalization. To ensure equitable learning, every student in any classroom, in any school, public or private, should have the same opportunity as any other student for being taught by a great teacher. As we are all aware, it's only a great teacher who is able to provide equitable learning. But because of various reasons, some categories of learners may partially or completely be denied access to equitable learning for various reasons. Such learners may include, among others, the girl child.
Sorry, Stella, it's just that it appears that you're sharing your screen, so we're able to see your Word document. So I don't know if this is intentional or if you would like to stop sharing your screen and continue with your keynote intervention.
To help me also move faster on my presentation, and in case time cut me short, you people would have had access to my, I don't know if that is okay, or I leave it.
Okay, that's up to you. Thanks for clarifying.
Okay. So I was like, these learners include, among others, the girl child learners living with HIV and AIDS and other chronic illnesses, child households, learners with special learning needs, learners living with disability, among others. Examples of these learners who are many times marginalized and discriminated are some because of sex, race, ethnicity, cultural, social, or political background, because of gender and age. Different policies exist to support equitable access to learning, like in Uganda, but the implementation is at a slow pace for various reasons. We have policies like in the Local Government Act, Education Act 2008, Universal Primary Education Policy, Inclusive Education Policy, and Education for All Policy, among others. But you realize that these policies, yes, are well stipulated, but implementation is taking a slow pace. And especially as a refugee teacher, we are challenged when it comes to ensuring equitable access to learning in displacement for various reasons. One of the reasons is we receive very minimal psychosocial support offered to both learners and then the teachers. On many occasions, teachers are not considered. For example, I'm a refugee teacher from South Sudan. So upon displacement, it means I have traumatic events that I have gone through. But when we come to a displacement camp like this, the teachers are really not taken so much into consideration so that they are psychosocially supported. Even the learners, by the way, only a few sections of the learners receive maximum psychosocial support. So that is one of the challenges that is making us not to provide equitable access to learning. Another important point is, as a refugee teacher, I'm glad I received my training in Uganda, but my fellow refugee teachers from South Sudan are not given support. For example, they are not employed as teachers within the settlements. For one reason, they have academic papers from South Sudan, which cannot be used here. So many times these teachers are recruited like teaching assistants or given any other employments, not their professional employment. So that leaves a gap to a refugee teacher in the implementation of equitable access to learning. Another challenge is on language, looking at the diverse cultural background that we come from. There are very many languages. A case in point is Ogili Hill Nursery and Primary School, where I teach. We have more than 12 languages spoken at school. So you can see the dilemma that every teacher is undergoing. It is hard to harmonize or to see which language should really be used in the school, because many of them know their local languages other than English as a means of instruction and communication here in Uganda. So this leaves a section of the learners out of the learning process because there is no unifying language that can be used to them. So many of them tend to leave school and manage their own things. However, a number of things have been put in place. For example, in the use of language, we are employing different strategies so that these learners at least keep up with the rest of the learners in school. We are using translation or the use of multilingualism, the use of a variety of instructional materials to aid, but that is not enough. There need to be other things to be put in place. Another important point is on culture. Culture is making us not provide equitable learning to all the refugee learners, looking at tribal differences of the tribes. There are certain tribes in my country that do not support education, for example, to boys and girls, because like a tribe that is for cattle grazing would want the boy child to attend to that. A girl child is supposed to be married off as early as 13 years old or immediately on the onset of menstruation. So when they come to Uganda, it is a different story. We would want all these learners in school, but because of their culture, you find that we have learners on and off attending school due to early marriage, teenage pregnancy. Though we have a number of dialogue, community dialogue, that we are trying.
Stella,
so that
just to let you know that you have 2 minutes left, and I'm sorry to cut you short, but so if you can just use the next 2 minutes to wrap up, and then also make sure that you pose your question to the panelists.
Other points are in the tribal conflict over age learners. We have gap analysis. We have delay in delivery of instructional materials, large class size, workload, hard living conditions for teachers. A few things should be put in place to ensure this. Both teachers and learners need more psychosocial support. Teachers from South Sudan need support in equating their papers. A lot of system strengthening, especially on policies regarding equitable access to be implemented. Scale up bridging course, teachers to receive additional training in handling learners with special needs. Teachers and teaching assistants should be trained on additional languages. Recruit more teachers. There's need to provide teachers with accommodation. Consideration should be extended to the boy child in terms of materials. Continuous community dialogue. Teachers' welfare needs to be improved. And also on my point, sponsorship to be offered to change mindset of certain tribes towards education. Learners to school. In the interest of time, I have one question to pose after completion of my presentation. I am aware we have different representatives from the different countries hosting refugees. So my question is, what are you doing, or what are you going to do, or will be doing to enable teachers to adequately handle equitable access to learning in displacement? Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for sharing, Stella. It's really useful to hear your experiences and also your concrete recommendations based on your experience as a teacher. And so we're looking forward to hear answers to the question you pose soon once we start the panel. But now let me first introduce the second keynote speaker, Mr. Akoy Mayan, who is a 14-year-old boy from South Sudan, living in the refugee camp for internally displaced people, Mahad. So I leave it to you to further introduce yourself, and you also have 5 minutes. And please remember to pose your question in the end, and I will let you know when you have 2 minutes left. Thank you so much, Akoy. We cannot hear you, Akoy, so it seems like you're still muted.
All right.
Okay, thanks, great.
You're welcome. Hi, everyone. At my Genesis, I would like to recognize the presence of all the participants from linguistic locations attending this well-organized conference. My name is Akoy Mayanpur. I'm a South Sudanese by nationality, a high school student at Salam Secondary School. My dream work is becoming a lawyer. I live in Juba at Mahat IDP camp. I came here during the 2013 crisis conflict that happened in Bor and other parts of South Sudan. I'm one of the children with disabilities supported by Light for the World. I have a physical disability. Problem facing children with disabilities living in IDP camps. One of them is a lack of food. Since the World Food Program usually distributes once in a month or maybe one after 3 months or something like that. And as you know that we are IDPs, we came from different locations. We are just living here. Like we came from different places. So our parents are not working, and that's where we don't get food. Second point is I would like to talk about accessibility. Have a job and enough money also to take us to the outside hospital, since they are even very far, and some of us have their disability in the leg, so they cannot work, and there is no wheelchairs and the other things they can use so that they can go there, and it's also far. My second point, I would like to talk about the schools. Schools are not accessible. Children with disabilities, they are not included in the schools, like they are not given chance and opportunity. Also, learning materials, they are lacking learning materials. When I talk of learning materials, I mean materials for blind children, like the moving stick, which they can use for going to school. Also, material for lame children, those who have problems in leg and in moving. They don't have wheelchairs and other things that they can use for moving. And also the sign language dictionary for the people who have problem in their ears. And also children with epilepsy, they don't have a good treatment. They are not given good treatment, like also medicine and be treated. As I came to my conclusion, I have some questions here. Both. One is, why are children with disabilities in IDP's camp not a priority in your education programming? Like now, the only organization that deal with us are the disability focused organization like Light for the World and etc. But we also need our rights from the other organizations who deal with all the children those who are not disabled and those who are disabled. They also have to include us in their programs, not only disability-focused organization. My second question is, what is the future plan of UN agencies and donors to influence organizations to take inclusion as a priority? As I finish my questions, I would just like to give a suggestion. I suggest if mainstream organizations include disability in their programming, starting from their policy up to the implementation. Thanks. I would like to end here.
Thank you so much, Okoye, for sharing your experiences, but also for posing these really clear challenges to us, and also excellent questions that we're looking forward to address, and also for raising many issues that's related both to your situation in an IDP camp, but also in many other context settings, and the importance of ensuring to include disability in all approaches related to the right to education. So thanks so much. So now we'll move on to the panel discussion. And the panel discussion will take place in two sections. We'll first have a session that will focus directly on answering the questions that's been posed by Stella and Okoye. And then we'll have a shorter second part where we will look more to the future and look into how we can address and move forward from here. So I'll now introduce the list of panelists who will speak, and then they will have each 5 minutes to further present themselves and also to address the questions that have been posed. So first, we will hear from Her Excellency, Dr. Nejwa Kabaylat, who is the General Secretary of the Ministry of Education for Administrative and Financial Affairs from Jordan. Secondly, we will hear from Ms. Jennifer Roberts, who is a Senior Education Officer in UNHCR. And then we will hear from Ms. Camilla Partica, who is a Policy Officer at the Directorate General for Humanitarian AIDS Operations in the European Commission. And then we will hear from Ms. Anna Maria Tammy, who is an education specialist and thematic lead for education in crisis and conflict from the Global Partnership for Education. And fifth and lastly, as part of the first session of the panel, we'll hear from Ms. Catherine Anna Moore, who is the Gender and Education in Emergency lead of the UN Girls Education Initiative. So without more introductions, I'll give the word over first to Her Excellency, Dr. Nejwa Kabaylat. So you have 5 minutes to start off this panel discussion. Thanks.
يعطيكم العافية جميعا. يسعدني بداية أن أرحب بكم في هذا اللقاء العالمي الذي يتناول العديد من المحاور المهمة، وخاصة فيما يتعلق بعمل الحكومات التي تتعرض بلدانها للأزمات والطوارئ، وما يتعلق بالنزوح واللجوء، وما تعكسه هذه الأزمات في بعض الدول على الدول المجاورة، حيث تعد الأردن من أكثر البلدان استقبالاً للاجئين، وفتحت أبواب الضيافة لهم من مختلف الجنسيات وخاصة حركة اللجوء السوري، الأمر الذي انعكس على مختلف القطاعات الحيوية في المملكة الأردنية الهاشمية، والتي يعتبر قطاع التعليم من أهمها. ندرك جميعاً أن التعليم الجيد والمنصف حق للجميع، وخاصة في ظل الأزمات والطوارئ، ويعتبر من أهم أولويات صانعي القرار وراسمي السياسات في الحكومات في مختلف بلدان العالم، لإيمانهم المطلق بأن التعليم في مثل هذه المراحل يعتبر طوق النجاة الحقيقي من الأزمات والعامل الرئيس في صون حياة المواطنين وتمكين دولهم من الازدهار والتقدم. كما نعلم أن الحكومات في البلدان كافة تسعى جاهدة في سبيل صون حق التعليم واستمراريته والنهوض به رغم التحديات التي تواجهها، فتسعى دائما إلى تذليل تلك الصعوبات بمختلف الوسائل المتاحة لضمان استدامة العملية التعليمية، مثل تأسيس الشراكات مع مختلف الجهات المعنية بقطاع التعليم سواء كانت الداخلية أو الخارجية، وخاصة أن التخطيط لاستدامة التعليم في ظل الأزمات هو ركن استراتيجي في عمل راسمي السياسات التعليمية وليس استجابة مؤقتة أو رد فعل مباشر. وهنا وفي ظل ما تقدم لابد من الإشارة إلى الخطط المنهجية التي عملت المملكة الأردنية الهاشمية على تنفيذها، مثل خطة الاستجابة الأردنية للأزمة السورية التي سعت لتلبية احتياجات الأردنيين والسوريين على حد سواء وتوفير التعليم العادل والجيد، والذي يعد أحد المجالات الرئيسة للتخطيط والتنفيذ. كما عملت وزارة التربية والتعليم على توسيع نطاق وصول التعليم للاجئين السوريين من خلال دمجهم في مدارس المجتمع المضيف بنظام الفترتين في المدارس النظامية ومدارس نظام الفترتين ومخيمات اللجوء السوري ومراكز التعليم غير الرسمية. كما نفذت الوزارة العديد من المبادرات لتعزيز خبرات التعلم وتخفيف التوترات، مثل برنامج مدرستي، البرلمانات الطلابية وغيرها من البرامج التي تنفذها وزارة التربية والتعليم. وأيضاً نفذت وزارة التربية والتعليم العديد من الدراسات مع شركائها لتقييم التدخلات التربوية والسياسية المتبعة في التعامل مع ملف أزمة اللجوء.
Sorry to interrupt you, Dr. Najwa. There seems to be some issues related to the interpretation. And I think now some have lost their interpretation. Okay, so it's coming back. Yes.
I can continue?
Okay, so you can go ahead. Thank you so much.
Okay. فنفذت وزارة التربية والتعليم my voice, it's clear or not? أوكي. ومع ذلك نفذت وزارة التربية والتعليم العديد من الدراسات مع شركائها لتقييم التدخلات التربوية والسياسات المتبعة في التعامل مع ملف أزمة اللجوء السوري.
I'm really sorry, but it's still a bit challenging to hear in some of the interpretation channels, and I think some, especially in the English channel, I think the interpreter is speaking very fast.
Sorry, Beata, so, can I come in there?
Yes, please do.
Can Ramadan stop interpreting, please?
إذن في الأردن اتخذت يعني سياسات بأن التعليم هو حق للجميع لكل طفل على أرض الأردن بغض النظر عن جنسه وجنسيته. لذا طبقت البرامج ذاتها على الطلبة الأردنيين والطلبة من الجنسيات الأخرى. وحتى بعد جائحة كورونا البرامج التي طبقت لمعالجة الفاقد التعليمي طبقته أيضاً في مدارس اللجوء السوري ومدارس الفترات المسائية، وأيضاً لتحقيق التعليم العادل للجميع. وقعت الأردن على استراتيجية التعليم الدامج الذي يؤمن التعليم أيضاً لذوي الإعاقات، وغيرت في كودات البناء لتصبح جميع مدارس الأردن مراعية لاحتياجات ذوي الحاجات الخاصة. تقريباً في مدارس الأردن حوالي 130 ألف طالب سوري يقدم لهم التعليم الذي يقدم للطلبة الأردنيين على نفس السوية. وأيضاً يتم اختيار المعلمين الذين يقومون بتدريس الطلبة السوريين بنفس الآلية التي يختارون فيها المعلمين الذين يدرسون الطلبة الأردنيين من حيث امتلاكهم للكفايات اللازمة للتدريس. يعني أحاول أن أختصر لأن هناك مشكلة كما تشيرون بالترجمة، ولكن قامت وزارة التربية والتعليم أيضاً مؤخراً باستحداث قسم خاص داخل وزارة التربية والتعليم لإدارة المخاطر والأزمات ضمن وحدة تطوير الأداء المؤسسي، وذلك لمأسسة العمل في مثل هذه الظروف. شكرا لكم لحسن الاستماع، وسأبقى معكم لأي أسئلة في النقاشات اللاحقة إن شاء الله تعالى.
Thank Thank you so much, Dr. Najwa Kabailat, and I'm so sorry for the issues on the interpretation. And I do hope you have more time in the Q&A session to also elaborate on some of your excellent points from the work being done by the government of Jordan, and also how you work on the Syrian refugee crisis. So thanks so much. And before we move to Jennifer, I thought I would just repeat the questions that were asked by Stella and Akoy, just to make sure that they're all fresh in mind for the remaining panelists. So the question that was raised by Stella was, what are you doing or planning to do to allow teachers to provide equitable and quality education in displacement settings? And the questions that were posed by Akoy was, why is it difficult to include disability in your programming, which was addressed to all actors, UN actors and others, but also governments. And then secondly, that in the camp where he's living, only disability-focused organizations include inclusion. So what is the future plan of UN organizations and agencies and donors to influence organizations to ensure that inclusion is a mandate area? So with these questions now fresh in mind, Jennifer, the word is yours. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Beata. And thank you very much for inviting me to be part of today's event. It's an honor to share this platform with so many distinguished guests. As you mentioned in the introduction, over the last 2 months, the world has witnessed displacement at a scale and a speed that we've never seen before. Over 5.2 million refugees have fled Ukraine, and an estimated 7.1 million have been internally displaced in just 60 days. By way of comparison, it took 2.5 years for a similar percentage of the Syrian population to be displaced. What we know from similar crises is that typically 1/3 of all refugees are school-aged children. And this percentage is slightly higher amongst those fleeing Ukraine. And this really highlights the need for us to put education at the heart of a humanitarian response. We need to be able to respond quickly, but also sustain those services that those children and young people so need. So what do we need to do to make sure that the collective commitments to education can be realized? I'll sum it up with the phrase, respond immediately and think long-term. Mass displacement, like we're seeing, means that education systems need to expand rapidly and eventually contract when the crisis abates. And what we know, unfortunately, is that that part takes much longer than anticipated. Very often it takes several years, up to more than 5 years, before we start seeing people returning home or seeing peace, and even longer, as Dr. Najma was saying, with the Syrian crisis. Now, this scale of response is only possible when we situate governments at the center, with organizations like the UN and NGOs and donors supporting their efforts. And this is also the vision set out in the Global Compact on Refugees. In trying to answer some of the questions about what this would take, particularly what it takes for learners, what it takes for children, for those with disabilities and meeting their needs, but also the needs of teachers, I'd like to propose 4 key actions. The first action is to anticipate that we need to plan, we need to put in place policies and actions that can support immediate actions in a crisis and not wait until the onset of the situation. But I think, we also need to be able to plan for a range of eventualities, whether those displacements are slow and growing slowly or very rapid. And I think if we had asked the Polish ministry if they would think about planning for accepting over 1 million refugee children in a short space of time, they would have said that that was a bit of a fantasy exercise. But these things can so easily, unfortunately, become a reality. Planning needs to think about, how do we scale up provision quickly? What are the administrative barriers that might exist to having refugee and displaced children access education and enroll? What do we need to do to support teachers, as Stella has asked? How do we recognize qualifications from different countries? And how do we make sure that we draw on the skills of refugee teachers? The second action is that we need to monitor. We need good quality data about who is and who is not receiving education. It's not enough to know that 48% of refugees globally are not in school. We need to know what are their ages, where are they, which districts, are they children with disabilities, and if so, what type, where are they located, and also what are the gender and cultural barriers to accessing education so that responses can be appropriate. We also need to include as the third action. And inclusion means not just including refugees in the national systems as the most sustainable option for ensuring access to education. It means that this cannot be the responsibility of one group. Inclusion and being inclusive means collaboration across directorates in ministries, across ministries, but also adopting a whole of society approach means that it's the contributions of UN, NGOs, donors, civil society in providing the specialized support programs to make sure that people are ready to enter schools and that they progress and thrive. Inclusion also means listening to the voices of refugees, the displaced, and those most affected. And I think that the questions that we've been asked today, particularly about disability, are difficult to answer and ones that we have not adequately engaged with as a global community. The fourth action is that we need to sustain. As I've said, displacement, people are displaced for far longer than anybody ever anticipates or wishes for. So we need to look at a full range of education services being available, from primary through secondary and access to tertiary education. It's only by supporting people to complete secondary education and progress further that we can start to address intergenerational poverty and make sure that there are opportunities for everybody. When we're asked about what is the role of the UN and other groups, the Global Compact on Refugees sees the UN, particularly UNHCR.
Sorry to jump in, Jennifer, just to let you know that
as
we
bringing
have
everybody
1 minute
together.
left. Yes, thanks.
Thanks. So it sees the role of the UN as being one of being a convener, trying to bring people together in support of collective action. How do we draw on the experiences of different organizations? Our role is also to advocate for ministries and advocate for the voices of refugees. And as we heard today, we need to do more to advocate to make sure that those who are most at the fringes and are not being served by existing programs are heard and are addressed. We need to make sure that the goodwill of efforts is maximized, and so to advocate for those policies and to support governments make those policy changes as needed. And then finally, it's to be an implementer, but this complements the other roles. And I would like to just close by saying that this is such an important event to draw attention to not just the crisis in Ukraine, but the thousands and millions of children who are out of school and affected by displacement and other intersecting forms of vulnerability. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jennifer, for raising a lot of important points and also for shedding light on the work you're doing from UNHCR as well. And we'll hopefully hear more once we go into the Q&A. So I just want to again remind participants to do use the Q&A box and pose your questions to all the distinguished panelists there. So I'm a bit wary of time, so we'll just move ahead with the next speaker, who is Ms. Camilla Pertica from the European Commission. So the word is yours, Camilla. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Beate, and thank you very much for the opportunity to join this important panel and present the EU perspective on equitable access to education, and especially in displacement context. As you know, the EU is one of the leading humanitarian and development donors, and we are extremely committed to provide efficient context-specific response, but also to strengthen resilience and address root causes of crisis and forced displacement. Education is for us a vital part of this response. This is key for personal development, for social transformation, but also to improve equity, prosperity, to create credible pathways to resilience and peace building. We all collectively here understand the importance of addressing education needs since the onset of the crisis. Children's and young people's swift return to education and schooling is indeed a major factor in the return to stability, help alleviating psychological stress, avoiding gender-based violence, connect young people with social and health services, and create a sense of community. We have heard about the catastrophic humanitarian situation in Ukraine, but this is only one of many crises and conflicts. As the EU, we address also Syrian refugees in Turkey, Lebanon and Jordan, Afghan refugees in Iran and Pakistan, Congolese refugees in the Great Lake regions, Venezuelan crisis, Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh, and many others. We also need to understand the overall growing challenges related to the education response, which is due to the increased length and complexity of crisis, the increasing levels of displacement, but also numerous attacks on education facilities and on learners and teachers. And this is accompanied by the global learning losses that we've seen during COVID and a structural underinvestment of the education sector. Jennifer mentioned the joint and coordinated response that is very much needed. And the EU is very engaged to strengthen its policy framework and funding to education. We have a very comprehensive education in emergency policy framework with strong commitments to provide access to quality and safe education to the most vulnerable children, those affected by crisis, those in refugee and internally displaced context, with a particular emphasis on girls and children with disabilities. So I think this is part of the response to ACOI question, what we need to do. We need to clearly prioritize those who are vulnerable in our response. We need to protect, promote, and fulfill their right to education. We need also to step up our efforts to link the shorter-term humanitarian response with longer-term development-oriented solutions that provide for greater resilience and contribute to lasting peace. All of that, the political engagement, advocacy is very important, but this should be accompanied by adequate levels of financial commitments. For us in the EU, it means an investment of 10% of initial humanitarian aid budget dedicated to education emergencies. And this is combined with the 10% investment in education from the EU development instruments. This money, this investment should be efficient. And that means not only restoring access to learning for those vulnerable out of school, for girls, for children with disabilities. This is also working on quality and strengthening learning outcomes. And here I think the important part is indeed the support we provide to teachers. Over 70% of our funded projects address motivation, skills, competences, professional development of teachers, providing them not only financial incentives, but also comprehensive training packages that include pedagogical skills, digital skills, but also psychosocial support that was mentioned, and understanding of the protection needs of children, of the conflict-sensitive education, and creating really positive societal change. For that, we also need to work with communities to make campaigns for for greater sensitization, mobilization, awareness raising. I think that last but not least, we should be aware of the overall protection of education aspects, and we need to the schools to be safe places that are protected in all environments, and we really work towards this goal. Last but not least, and I'm finishing here, to strengthen the effectiveness of our intervention, we strive to break the siloed approach and sectoralization of the response. We think that this is extremely important, that our interventions and activities we support both complement and reinforce each other to create the whole child approach, to create responsive protective interventions, and to accompany access to education with child's psychosocial well-being, mental health, nutrition, gender-based violence, protective services. And only by adopting this comprehensive approach, we can keep girls and boys safe from violence, conflict, and hazards that happen in and around schools. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Camilla. And then we'll move on to the next speaker, who is Ms. Anna Maria Tammy from the Global Partnership for Education. Thanks.
Thank you so much. I'm really delighted to participate in this distinguished panel today. We just heard from our keynote speakers of the challenges faced by children and teachers in context of displacement. On the flip side, we know that children overwhelmingly identify education as their top priority in times of crisis. Today, I wish to highlight the importance of ensuring sufficient financing to achieve quality education for marginalized children, including those who are displaced. Firstly, there needs to be sufficient financing of education in emergencies in humanitarian aid budgets of states and other members of the international community. There has been progress in financing education in emergencies since the Global Humanitarian Summit, particularly through the establishment of Education Cannot Wait, which was set up, among other things, to help reposition education as a priority on the humanitarian agenda. Now, as we just heard from Camilla, the European Commission is leading the way with its commitment to spend 10% of humanitarian aid in education. We need to keep up this positive trend, given we know that humanitarian needs are only increasing with multiple crises of COVID, climate change, and conflict, which are putting education ever more at risk and contributing to the displacement crisis. Secondly, we need to invest in sustainable solutions for crisis-affected children so that each child has access to a full cycle of accredited education. Children's educational needs and protracted crises last a long time, sometimes the duration of their entire schooling. This means that our solutions need to be long-term too, with the aim of including displaced children in national public education systems. The Global Partnership for Education supports partner countries in these efforts by strengthening gender-responsive planning, mobilizing coordinated action and financing to enable transformative change, and strengthening the capacity of partners. As part of these efforts, we invest in quality teachers and teaching in all partner countries, as well as making schools safe and inclusive so that children, including those with disabilities, enjoy their basic human rights without discrimination. In Ethiopia, which hosts more than 800,000 refugees, we were able to leverage funding from other partners to help make public schools more inclusive for refugee children. The government of Ethiopia is using funds from GPE, the World Bank, and the Danish Ministry of Foreign Affairs in one single program of $80 million to improve access and key services to refugee schools, support the long-term goal of integrating refugee education in the national system so that all students will be served in the same schools, as well as address the barriers faced by girls to improve their learning and participation. Overall, we are working with governments in 76 lower income countries, driving transformation at scale to get the most vulnerable girls and boys in school, improve teaching and learning, and build resilient education systems that are capable of withstanding shocks and adapting to new challenges. Part of making sure that systems are prepared for and responsive to displacement crises involves working with national governments to increase the volume, equity, and efficiency of domestic finance for education. We are now in a challenging post-COVID-19 environment where 2/3 of low and lower middle income countries have cut their education budgets since the onset of the pandemic. We need to reverse this trend to ensure education for all. And to that end, GP works with ministries of education and finance to help them safeguard education spending. In all of this work, partnership is really the key to success. For example, we support civil society to be active and influential in shaping education policy to better meet the needs of communities, especially of vulnerable and marginalized populations. Our Fund for Advocacy and Social Accountability, Education Out Loud, is the largest civil society fund for education in the world, and it currently supports CSO advocacy in 22.
Just to let you know that you need to wrap up soon, and if you can finish in 1 minute, that would be lovely. Thanks.
Sure. So the fund currently supports CSO advocacy in 22 fragile and conflict-affected countries. We also work closely with partners such as Education Cannot Wait and UNHCR in countries like Afghanistan, Bangladesh, Chad, Somalia, and Yemen to facilitate dialogue and ensure that our support to crisis-affected children is coordinated, complementary, and that there are linkages across different planning and financing approaches. I thank the Global Campaign for Education so much for inviting GPE to this event, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much for sharing, Anna Maria. And then next we have Catherine Anamore from Ungai. I hope you are ready, and you will be wrapping up this part of the first session of the panel today to answer directly to the questions posed before we'll move on to the second part, looking at solutions and where to go next. So Catherine, the word is yours. Please go ahead.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to participate in this panel today. So we know from the other speakers that based on pre-pandemic data, refugee girls are half as likely as their male peers to have access to secondary education. And one major reason for this is gender-based violence and attacks on education that specifically target women and girls in crisis, including displaced and refugee women and girls. Some data to support these facts are, for example, INE's 2021 Mind the Gap report, which highlights this issue, suggesting that between 2015 and 2019, 21 countries had data on attacks on education that explicitly targeted girls and women. Also, according to Unicef and UNFPA, from a press release this year, globally, over 11 million girls may never go back to school after the pandemic. An additional 10 million girls are at risk of child marriage over the next decade, and 2 million additional cases of female genital mutilation may occur. These figures highlight the gendered crisis within a crisis facing all girls and women, including refugee, displaced, and disabled women and girls, which require urgent actions. Importantly, before and during crises, Ungai works to strengthen gender equality in education sector planning and eliminating school-related gender-based violence. This work ensures that systems are safe and inclusive by design and by how they are implemented, monitored, and reported on. Ungai also works to address gender challenges faced by refugee and displaced women and girls in multiple ways, developing resources to strengthen gender equality in education and emergencies, advocating with and for girls to access gender-responsive and transformative EIE programs and services, and conducting and elevating research on the gendered barriers to inclusive education for girls in crisis. I'll hone in on one recent example of Ungai's work, which was championing the development of a requested open-source interagency resource that is the first of its kind to strengthen gender equality in education and emergency responses. Humanitarian actors, government stakeholders, and feminist youth-led organizations expressed the need for practical resources and guidance to ensure EIE responses were gender responsive at a minimum. Ungai listened to this need. Since 2019, in partnership with INE and ECW, Ungai championed developing the Eia Gen Kit. It was developed through a consultative process that involved over 80 stakeholders working on gender and EIE at global and country levels. It also included reviewing 150 existing gender and EIE tools and resources. The Eia Gen Kit includes tip sheets, checklists, and questions, and it's meant to support actors, including female and male teachers and students affected by disabilities, translate their commitments and desires for providing gender equality in EIE to on-the-ground actions in real time, from designing and planning to reflecting on and implementing, monitoring, and evaluating EIE programs that consider gender equality at every turn. We're seeing real promising emergent results since the launch and piloting of the Gen Kit, which was piloted in South Sudan and Uganda in 2021 with our partners at Plan International. I'll highlight a couple examples. In Uganda, Plan International Uganda and other Education Cannot Wait implementing partners worked with communities and used the Eia Gen Kit to jointly reflect on their programming. As a result of using the kit, community leaders and school stakeholders, including teachers and students, assessed the school environments. They jointly identified ways to make their school improvement plans more inclusive and equitable for all students. They developed standard operating procedures for recruiting female teachers in Uganda and ensured that gender responsive.
Know that you have like a minute left, so you need to be wrapping up soon. Thanks.
They identified gender responsive data collection mechanisms. In South Sudan, Plan International South Sudan used the kit with male and female community leaders, school administrators, parents, and students, and they made their wash infrastructures more inclusive for children with disabilities, and breastfeeding rooms for adolescent mothers were identified as a future need. So you can see from these ideas that we are using the Eia Gen Kit at UNGAI as a way to continue championing gender equality in education emergencies. UNGAI is the objective third-party actor for providing a critical and feminist view of what's missing for girls' education in emergencies and convening different actors needed to produce solutions like the Gen Kit. We look forward to continuing to hear and act on important calls to action like those we heard from the panelists today, to work together on what's still missing and urgently needed to design effective solutions, ensuring gender equality is at the center of education systems and crisis responses for displaced and refugee women and girls, and for all girls and women. Thank you so much for the opportunity to participate today, and we look forward to hearing questions from the attendees.
Thank you so much, Catherine. So next we'll move on to a short sharing from two panelists who will focus on solutions and pathfinding. So first out is Christina Settelmeis. I'm sorry for mispronouncing your surname there, but she is the country director of Uganda JRS. And then secondly, we will hear from Miriam Jafar, who is from INE, the Inclusive Education Coordinator. So I think you can just speak for 5 minutes each, and then we'll move directly into the Q&A session after that. So Christina, please go ahead. The word is yours. Thanks.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for the invitation to this important event today. I'm happy that I'm part of this. Katie Moore has touched based on some very important activities, and today I will also highlight some examples from the field, what JRS is doing to promote gender responsive education, especially in Uganda, and with a focus on the refugee setting in Adjumani district. Maybe just to highlight, Uganda currently ranks among the top 4 refugee hosting nations in the world and is the largest in Africa with almost 1.6 million refugees, and 80% of them are women and children. In light of our JRS mission to accompany, serve and advocate, there is one question we must continually ask ourselves. How are we as JRS called to address this unprecedented reality? And for us, keeping girls in school is one of the key answers. At the end of 2019, we conducted a gender analysis in Adjumani at the border to South Sudan to identify and validate barriers to accessing and completing secondary education through a specific gender lens. Adjumani is the second largest refugee hosting district in Uganda with over 244,000 refugees in 19 settlements. Only 13% of youth are currently accessing secondary education in Adjumani. And of these, approximately 27% are girls. And COVID-19, we all know, has worsened the situation. Our study reveals several supply and demand barriers. We have heard some of them today already, which are impacting transition, access, retention, and performance of girls in secondary schools in Adjumani. Some supply barriers are inadequate menstrual hygiene management items, lack of trained teachers, especially female teachers. I'm happy that Stella is here today. Limited number of secondary schools, lack of and poor facilities, the distance.
So sorry, Christina, to interrupt, but there seems to be some issues with
quality
your
of education
network.
and
It's challenging
exclusion.
to hear you.
It is unfortunate. Is it better?
Yes, there's like some background noise, so it might help if you switch off your camera, but we can, or you can just try now and we'll see.
Let me try. Is it better?
Yes, I think that improved it slightly at least, but you need to speak a bit more to know.
Okay. The demand side barriers are clearly poverty and the cost of schooling in Adjumani, probably everywhere in Uganda. And also mentioned is the child, early and forced marriage, pregnancy, and the attitudes towards girls' education. The education of the girl child has not been traditionally valued within the cultures represented by the refugee population in northern Uganda. On the first day of our fieldwork in one of the selected settlements, a secondary school-age girl who had recently been forced to leave school because of early marriage and pregnancy summarized the traditional view of girls in her culture. She said, "We girls are born to bring cows, not to study." She continued, "I would like to complete my studies, become a nurse, help others, and be happy in the world." At the time of our fieldwork, her baby was 3 months old. Together with her peers in similar situations, she explained how she spends most of her time now doing domestic work. In her parting message to us, she asked us to help her return to school and concluded, "We are in prison now." With past support from Education Cannot Wait, JRS implemented a number of solutions to address these barriers and promote gender-responsive education activities in other parts of Uganda. Currently, we are doing secondary school infrastructure. We construct dormitories, classrooms, teacher accommodation, wash facilities like latrines and changing rooms for girls, science laboratory and library. We support with school fees for the most vulnerable students, mainly in boarding schools. We provide scholastic and hygiene material, textbooks and furniture. We provide vocational training, especially for those girls who have dropped out of school, especially during COVID-19 and also due to the forced and early pregnancies and marriages. We provide mental health and psychosocial support for teachers, students, parents, and community members. We do capacity building for teachers, school management members, women and mother groups. We have career guidance for students' activities. We focus on awareness raising and community sensitization on the importance of education generally,
Christina,
but especially...
you have 1 minute left, so you need to wrap up soon, just to let you know.
Yes,
but we are able
yes.
to hear you very loud and clear. Thanks.
Thank you. And especially on the importance of the education of the girl child. We are currently piloting a partnership with World Bicycle Relief to address the barrier of distance to school. And we are planning to start a daycare center to take care of the babies while the young mothers are in school. We are aware that if we want to address barriers to girls' education, we also need to focus on the boys. So both gender have to be addressed at the same time. We do that, and in short, this approach is consistent with the do no harm principle. Education has traditionally been one of the most poorly funded areas of humanitarian response, and secondary education especially was already underfunded before COVID-19. It is our all responsibility to advocate for the right to education so that every child has a seat in school. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Christina. And
sorry for the technical problems, sorry.
It's fine, I think we're all used to it now after 2 years of a pandemic and still doing lots of virtual meetings. I think we're fine. And the most important is to hear your message. So thanks so much. So next is Miriam. Are you ready?
Yeah, thank you.
Thank
Please
you.
allow me to start by thanking the Global Campaign for Education for the opportunity to be part of this discussion. And I hope I'll be able to answer some of the questions posted in the Q&A. I will switch off my camera if you allow me, just to avoid any internet connection issues. Okay, thank you. So the Interagency Network for Education and Emergencies mission is to ensure the right to equality, safe and relevant education for all who live in emergency and crisis context through prevention, preparedness, response and recovery. INE has 4 strategic priorities that can be found on our website. INE serves its members through several key functions: community building, convening, knowledge management, amplifying and advocating, facilitating and learning and providing. INE and its members work to support and uphold the right to education for all people affected by the conflict and crisis, and as a result address this point on non-discrimination. Unfortunately, we are not able to guarantee non-discrimination, but we do provide guidance, resources, and capacity building opportunities for our members to ensure that they have the tools and skills and to take inclusive approaches to their work in education and emergencies. An essential resource for all of us is the INE Minimum Standards for Education, which outlines key principles and standards to guide the education and emergencies sector. The INE minimum standards are derived from human rights and specifically from the right to education, as expressed in key human rights document. We are currently in the process of updating the INE minimum standards with our members to ensure they better reflect emerging good practice and new humanitarian infrastructure. We regularly have members reach out to us for information on our resources and how they can use them in their context. One recent example is an education practitioner working in Ukraine who is an INE member. She reached out to us because the NGO she's working with had to shift priorities due to the conflict. She was looking for our support to identify useful resources related to education of children with disabilities in emergencies. She mentioned that she found many resources, but it was hard to identify the most useful 2 or 3. That's when we shared the INE Pocket Guide, Education and Emergencies, Including Everyone, and the INE Pocket Guide to Supporting Learners with Disabilities that complement the INE minimum standards, particularly the cross-cutting issues reflected within them. These relate to human and children rights, gender, disability, HIV, etc. It takes a broad look at inclusive education principles and the types of actions that can be taken by the practitioners while planning, implementing, and monitoring education programs to make education in crisis contexts more inclusive. The feedback from the practitioner in Ukraine came positive. They were able to use the principles from the Pocket Guide, in particular the questions to guide and structure their planning. In fact, reaching out to INE Secretariat is one way to get this type of support, but we also have some systems in place for members to ask questions and co-create solutions. We have the Ine Community of Practice, which is an online platform that facilitates peer-to-peer communication and moderated discussions on the full range of education and emergencies topics in many languages. There are also channels on gender, inclusive education, distance education, etc. We also have the help desk, which is designed to respond to questions about education and emergencies tools and resources, as well as facilitating capacity development. Both the community of practice and the help desk are available to all INE members, and they are for free. As mentioned earlier, INE has multiple strategic priorities, and the stakeholders using its resources are diverse and involved in education and emergencies. Since it is said that sufficient numbers of trained and well-supported teachers are key to widening access to safe, quality education services for children, INE developed resources for teachers training, like the Teacher in Crisis Context training for primary school teachers, Teachers in Crisis Context peer coaching pack. Actually, the TIC training pack responds to a critical gap in open source, competency-based teacher training materials that provide coverage and foundational knowledge and skills required by teachers in crisis contexts, where teacher training is often limited to ad hoc workshops. Finally, it would also be great to highlight that despite the resources that we have...
Just to let you know that you have to wrap up soon. So if you can finish in like 2 minutes.
Sure,
thanks.
yeah. Thank you. Finally, it would be great to highlight that despite the resources that we have and the capacity building opportunities that we provide, there are still resource and tool gaps that were either identified or that we will continue to identify. Soon we will start an inclusive education tools and evidence mapping. This mapping exercise will inform the development of global public goods related to inclusive education in emergencies. Thank you. And I will send the links in the chat. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Miriam. And thanks for sharing. And I think that goes for all of you, both as panelists and participants. If you have any useful information, reports, advocacy messages that should be shared, and that's also really useful. And I know that the GCE team has already shared some material relevant to the Global Action Week for Education and the Education in Emergencies campaign that can be further spread on social media and also used towards advocacy purposes. So now I'm really sorry that we're a bit delayed in the event, which leaves us a bit shorter time for the Q&A session, but we have received a handful of excellent questions that have come in from participants. And I think you as panelists will have access to read the questions as well, but I thought I'll just highlight a few of them, and then the panelists are free to raise their hand if they want to intervene to the specific questions. So there is one question around concrete measures that organizations and agencies have taken to address attacks on schools and students and teachers. And a second question that's directed to GPE on how to ensure that intervention funds are earmarked for refugees or IDPs are actually being utilized in education systems. And then there's also a question on following up, I would say, from the question posed by Akoy on how to ensure children and youth with disabilities full access to inclusive education in emergency situations, and then also a question on how to accelerate disability inclusive education in emergency settings. And then a more like overarching question in the end on how to build and strengthen resilience, both in education systems, but also directly related to the role of teachers and learners, and how we can work on also strengthening the voices of those directly affected by displacement, refugees, both including pupils, students, and teachers, and how those voices can be further leveraged up to decision makers. So it's a great handful of a lot of questions, and I'm sorry that we won't have time to like really go in depth, but I really encourage all of you to continue to engage in these questions. So I think now with the limited time we have, I'll allow like each speaker to just speak shortly to the question that you feel was mostly directed towards your organization, agency, or government. And then we'll try to do a quick round, and then we have to leave some time in the end for closing remarks and to wrap up the session. And then if not all questions are addressed, there's also an opportunity to use the chat, but also to engage later on. Thanks. So I think we can just start in the same order as we did for the first round of panels. So if Dr. Eia Gen, is there any specific questions that you would like to address? Okay, I can't hear you, so I think I'll just move on to Jennifer, and I see you already on camera. And then Dr. Najra Kabailat, if you have anything you want to add, please write so in the chat or, yeah, thanks.
Thanks so much. I'm going to try and address the question that was asked about refugee participation and refugee influence on policies. And I think this is a very important one. Very often there are needs assessments that are done at the start of an emergency, which are based on interviews and discussions with children and teachers and parents. But I think it's about sustaining that. Annually, UNHCR tries to do a participatory assessment. But I think one of the things that is important is that those findings go back into education working groups and are shared and discussed, and that there are regular opportunities also for Ministry of officials to hear from refugees. And for, you know, that it's something to consider how we actually set that up and institutionalize that. So thanks so much for the question.
Thanks so much for answering, Jennifer, and also for excellent use of time, as we need to be really swift and concise in our answers now to be able to address them all. And Camilla, do you want to continue? Thanks.
Yes, thanks, Beate. I think that I mentioned the protection of education several times, so maybe I will answer this question. You are probably best placed to deal with this question, but let me, at least from the EU perspective, what we are doing to trying to end attacks on education. I think this is an important aspect that needs to be addressed in order to have equitable access to education for all. And as the EU, we have several instruments, obviously, in our hands. We have the political and economic weight of the EU that we implement through political, security, human rights, dialogue, trade and aid relations. It is not only about political dialogue and awareness and advocacy. This is also about funding actively partners that advocate and work with governments on measures to end attacks on education, that also engage with armed forces or non or armed groups and create awareness about the importance of ending attacks on education, and this is also about exchanging good practices, creating platforms of collaboration around the issue that gather different stakeholders and provide opportunity to learn from each other. I think this is also through injecting the elements of protection and safety in the education support that we provide. There are much more that we can all collectively do, I think, in order to not only monitor, but also to and be aware, but also to end these attacks. And I think this is crucial if we want the right to education to be for every child in every context. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Camilla. And then Anna Maria, do you want to address perhaps the question that was directly oriented towards the GPE?
Thank you. And if it's okay, I'd also like to come briefly in on the resilience question. So just on resilience, I mean, from our end, We support that through planning and capacity development of our government partners and other education sector partners. So building on risk-sensitive as well as sex disaggregated data and evidence, and by promoting the integration of contingency planning together with targeted strategies that keep vulnerable children learning, including through during crises. On the question of utilization of funds, so basically key to GPE and our approach is that we support mutual accountability of different partners by strengthening the education sector coordination mechanisms at country level, so mainly local education groups. So we try to ensure that these groups are led by government, but also that they include representation from all key stakeholders, including civil society organizations, teacher associations, donors, and multilateral agencies. And so really it's a mutual effort to review progress in the sector and ensure that funds, both of the government and of partners such as GPE, are utilized towards the sector objectives that were identified in, for example, the education sector plans. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And Katie, are there any questions that you would like to address?
Sure, I'll address the first question on the resilient education systems. We can't have resilient education systems if we're not tackling gender-based violence. And this requires long-term strategies to address this issue. And it requires putting the tools and the resources in the hands of students and teachers so that they can understand what is gender-based violence and how to mitigate it. And a great example of how this is being done in an evidence-based manner is through Unicef's Communities Cares approach in Somalia and South Sudan, where they had a long-term transformative gender-based violence behavior change process with communities, facilitated with leaders, with students, where they got to the root of what is gender-based violence and what actions did the community want to take to mitigate and prevent and respond to it. And this actually unlocked further access to education for girls, as well as reducing gender-based violence through some research that was done by Johns Hopkins University. And so now this approach is being scaled in Somalia through community-based organizations, which also suggests my other response to what we can do to make education systems more resilient, which is involving non-traditional humanitarian actors, such as local community-based organizations, feminist youth-led organizations, women's rights organizations, and persons with disabilities organizations that already are responding to urgent needs and actions on the ground. So those are my responses, and happy to answer further questions in the chat.
Thank you so much. And next, if Christina, do you have anything you would like to add on to some of these questions?
I hope the network is a little bit better than before. I just can echo what Jennifer said. When we did our gender analysis, that starts from involving the community members, both nationals, the local community, but also the refugee community. So this is what JRS is doing when we start planning activities. How can we support? What are the needs on the ground? Not assuming something, but getting the real facts from the field. And the question about inclusiveness, I think for that is interesting because yes, inclusiveness is coming more and more. It is a requirement. Governments and stakeholders, they see that as a very urgent need that we have to be working also involving children with disabilities, but not just because it is an urgent need. Everybody can do that. If we are not a specialist in implementing inclusive education, then we first need to see, okay, what are the statistics? How many children are there with disabilities? We need to have the real figures. And then based on that, we need to see what can we do and what can we not do. And then at the end it comes to collaborating with those who are the experts in these fields so that we can respond to the need together, so that we collaborate and serve the people in need. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Christina. So time is really running fast. So Miriam, if you have something really short, so that we also allow for time for closing remarks.
Thank you. I would only say that for INE, for example, what we do is that we consult the members. And once we have a tool that we would like to either produce or to update, we consult the members, we consult the people that are concerned, if they are displaced, the persons, children with disabilities or whatsoever. And then based on the mapping and on the gap analysis, we do the whole work. So this is briefly what I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thanks so much. So now I just want to extend huge thanks to all the panelists and distinguished speakers. It's been really wonderful to hear from your work and experiences, and also to learn that there are, or to be reminded, I would say, that there are so many linkages and also cross-cutting issues amongst our different organizations and agencies, and really a huge area of future cooperation that we should tap into even more than what we're doing as a joint education community, to be able to address the dire challenges we're seeing with displacement, and also the multiple crises that are growing in more complex matters. So I know for sure that the discussion is not ending here, even if we had limited time for the Q&A, but we will continue both individually, but also as a joint community of different organizations. And there are a lot of important moments coming up in the next weeks and months, especially with the Sustainable Development Goal 4 coming up for review at the high-level political forum in July, and also with the Transformative Education Summit coming up this fall at UNGA, where we know that education and emergencies will be an important part of the agenda, also on securing further and stable and increased financing for education as some of the main issues where we really need to commit our actions together, which I think is a nice reminder also of all the advocacy messages that are developed as part of the Global Action Week for Education, but that really stem from the excellent work we're all doing together in this community. So I'll wrap up here by introducing the closing remarks, or wrapping up from my end and introducing the closing remarks that we have received virtually through a video message from Robert Jenkins, who is the Global Director of Education from Unicef. And again, thanks so much to everyone who has been listening in, and also thanks to the speakers. And I'm really looking forward to continuing these discussions with all of you. So we'll now see the video message from Robert Jenkins from Unicef. Thanks.
Let me begin by just thanking the Global Campaign for Education for the opportunity to be part of this important discussion. And let me also thank the co-panelists who strongly highlighted the need for maximizing our joint efforts to protect and advance, if you'd like, equitable access for learning for the most marginalized learners. We are acutely aware collectively, I know, of the impact conflict is having on children around the world, Ukraine being the most obvious example and very troubling example right now that we're all, I know, struggling with, to do all we can to support Ukrainian children, whether inside Ukraine as displaced children or as refugees. The numbers are absolutely staggering, but in no means is sadly that unique. We also see in Afghanistan and other countries where conflict and other challenges and, if you'd like, developments are affecting children and resulting in their displacement and resulting in their challenge to continue their learning. The numbers are alarming, they're increasing, but the silver lining, if there is one, is the resolve of us collectively to do all we can to reach children with quality learning opportunities. Let me just spend a minute highlighting that as we're emerging from COVID-19 around the world and school systems are opening, also the importance of reopening the school system so that all children, displaced children, refugee children, all marginalized children have access to learning. A recent report we issued that used the framework of RAPID, R-A-P-I-D, assessed the level of action countries have taken to effectively recover their education systems. There's quite a bit of disturbing, if you'd like, data of the lack of action. Let me run through it quickly, not on the numbers, but just on the framework. The R of RAPID is to reach every child and retain them in school. Disproportionately marginalized children were affected by school closures. Therefore, we need to proactively bridge them back in school. The need to assess their learning levels as they return in school. Those learning levels are even wider disparity because of the disproportionate impact of school closures that's had on marginalized children. So teachers and learning facilitators to assess learning levels to enable. The P is prioritizing teaching the fundamentals. I is including and increasing catch-up learning programs, critically important now. And D is developing psychosocial health and well-being so that all children can, in a sense, benefit from the learning opportunities provided and realize their full potential. I look forward to continuing to partner with all of you and engage with you as we all collectively step up to meet this incredible challenge. Thanks again for this opportunity, and again, look forward to being in touch.